The Orris Project. Book 1, Origin and Earth, by David J. Salisbury. Episode 3. 8. The envoy's entire body plunged into the mass of sand. Before letting go, he had taken a deep breath and locked it into his lungs. He ended up submerged only to his shoulders, but the act caused a layer of material to slough off the surface and tumble down the grade. The rumbling went on for another few seconds and sounded like thunder. Over the course of the next 4 hours, the envoy applied his plan for survival. He intentionally caused the avalanches, either with his hands or his feet, his only tools. While being careful to stay pressed against the needle's face, he kicked, shoved, and slammed his heels into the aggregate. These measures caused chain reactions that brought thousands of pounds of material deeper into the cave with each effort. When he had manipulated the pile down to about 20 feet above the floor of the refuge, he acknowledged that the slope had softened to a 45-degree decline. That, in concert with how close he was to the ground, convinced him to slide down the rest of the ramp pile on his backside. When he hit the solid rock floor, he rolled over onto it, away from the pile. He breathed deeply. The air, although poor in quality, was not only the thickest he had breathed since his arrival, it was damp. It was so pleasant to lie there and breathe the dense, damp air that he smiled, a rarity since arriving on Earth. He was in a state of exhaustion so deep that after lying still, sleep took him almost instantly. 9. When the envoy opened his eyes, it was as though he had not. It was lamp black in the refuge. Sprites and flashes of phantom light jumped and raced through his field of vision, but he knew that this was only his unstimulated eyes creating mischief. He had no bearings, but that did not discourage him. He was too excited to sit idle. On his hands and knees, he went out exploring with his fingertips, crawling like a baby. After only the first few feet, his hand ran into loose debris, the pile. He turned around and set off deeper into the cave. After 10 minutes of probing and feeling, he reached his goal. His right hand slid forward and splashed unseen ripples into the life-giving liquid. He scrambled ahead and lay his whole upper torso in the pool, submerging his face. Stopping himself after only a few sips, he drank from the pool. His body craved the water, but he would have to recondition himself to drink large quantities without vomiting. Light glowed on the ceiling about 15 minutes after he discovered the pool, and the cavern revealed itself once again. The dim light was adequate for the envoy, as his pupils were at full dilation. The first thing he noticed was that he had crawled past 12 pools before reaching the one he found in the dark. He laughed. After replacing his satchel and slinging his pack over his shoulder, he walked straight and fast toward the lake. 20 yards from the edge of the lake, a series of events interrupted the echoing sounds made by his boots, stopping him dead in his tracks. The first was a whip-crack sound so loud he could feel it in his gums, made worse by the echoing properties of the cavern. The pressure in the cave increased. He could feel the breath pushed out of his lungs. A quaking shook the floor so violently that he lost the ability to support himself, and his body slammed to the ground. The lake before him was churning, the peaks and valleys of the waves trading places, and breaking. It only lasted for 5 seconds, and once the floor movement had calmed, thunder crept in, getting louder and louder, until it was a steady, continuous rumble. He kneeled there anxiously, listening to the thunder for 30 seconds before deciding to ignore it. The discomfort from damp clothes, desperate thirst, and a pounding hunger made itself known once again. His entire body itched, and he was looking at a calm, clean, deep body of water. He dropped his pack and satchel, stripped off his damp clothing, and laid it all out to dry. He made the rest of the journey to the lake, where he waded in waist-deep before diving and swimming closer to its center. When he was close to the midpoint, he stopped and stretched out to see if he could feel the bottom with his toes. No. He took a deep breath and plunged himself beneath the surface, swimming down hard with his arms, trying to feel the bottom. About 3 feet down, toes still not touching, he heard a muted thunk sound, immediately followed by 2 more in rapid succession. He swam back up to the surface and as he emerged, tried to wrap his mind around what was happening in the cavern. The first thing he was aware of was the sound. Clicking and clacking and rain and thunder, all multiplied by 1,000,000. It was a hot, loud roar. The interior of the cavern was a beehive of motion. Rocks, small boulders, sand, and dust were crashing into the cave from the needle opening at unbelievable velocities. It was utter chaos. About 50 feet in front of him, a bright white plume of sparks exploded from the floor at a sharp angle toward the interior of the cave. It put the envoy in a shallow trance, broken only when a small piece of rock hit the water about 18 inches from his face. Finally recognizing the danger, he drew another deep breath and thrust himself back down into the lake as deep as he could go, which was only about 3 feet before his endurance failed. When he reached this depth, a spark of pain touched his forehead, above his right eyebrow. Almost as soon as he recognized that he had been hit, the turmoil above faded. It was only a second later when his lungs screamed at him. He kicked once and floated back to the surface. A fog of dust and silence received him. 10. The envoy crawled out of the lake, exhausted from the unexpected effort to avoid being hurt by the anomaly. Dark red blood dripped onto the light red rock bed, tracing his path. He pressed his palm to the wound, counting to 100 to give it time to clot. In place of where he left his bag, there was only a scratched and scuffed section of rock. Hand still pressed firmly to his forehead, he stood and walked deeper into the cave. He found the bag after only 3 minutes of searching. Standing above his pack, naked and dripping, he estimated it was about 20 yards deeper into the cave than he had left it. But his satchel was nowhere in sight.
I'll find it,
he thought, telling himself not to worry, even though losing the satchel was a certain death sentence. After scanning for only a few seconds, he spotted it nestled against a chunk of rock, which he surmised was a newcomer to the cave. Although he had been confident the items in the satchel would be unscathed, he smiled nonetheless after inspecting them and finding all parts intact. He repacked the satchel, hung it about his neck, and returned to his bag. 2 neat holes, an entrance and an exit, were in the canvas, and there were 2 cracked water bottles, but no damage otherwise. Once it was repacked and slung over his left shoulder, he picked up his still damp clothes and walked deeper into the cavern. After only 10 minutes, he came upon what he was looking for, a rock outcropping about twice as tall as he was and about 3 times as long. It stood only 10 feet from a water pool that was small but 2 feet deep at its center. He made this his camp for the rest of his time here until going under the influence of Sterilex. There were small outcroppings and several boulders near the feature, and he laid all his clothing out on them to dry more completely. He took all 10 intact bottles from his bag and filled them at the pool. He moved back to the outcropping and sat with his back against the massive rock and again emptied his bag onto the ground. He found the purse containing the small needle and thread kit that was part of his inventory. As he stitched up the holes in the canvas bag, the whole cavern became sharply brighter. The sun was passing over the opening, which meant he had little light left. With a day on the young Earth being only 10 hours, he guessed there was only enough light to see by for 2.5 or 3. He badly wanted to move on to his next chapter on the planet.
Tomorrow,
he thought.
I have to go tomorrow. I'm not spending any more time here.
He pulled out a bottle of water and drank half of it. He waited for the nausea, but it did not come, so he finished it. Without hesitation, he consumed a second bottle. His ribs hurt from the sheer volume of water pressed into his shrunken stomach. No matter, he had to urinate before he could go under, and he would make sure that happened. With a third bottle in hand, he watched the last of his vision wash out. The sprites and phantoms came back. Ignoring them, he began stretching his tired muscles, tendons, and ligaments in a long and elaborate ritual, necessary before going under. He started with his toes and feet, ankles, and on up through his legs, buttocks, and into his torso, shoulders, arms, hands, fingers. He finished with a series of neck rolls, then massaged his temples, ears, nose, and finally worked his way through his jaw muscles. Although the hunger sensation was strong, he wanted to move on, and eating that soon before going under was forbidden. He drank the third bottle of water and laid on his side, but sleep never came. 11. Once there was enough light to move about, the envoy stood up and brought his bag over to the pool. All 10 bottles were empty again, so filling them was a lengthy process. He shoved the full bottles into his bag and walked around, gathering his clothing and dressing as he went. The qualifications for the next location were simple. It had to be a permanent shelter, fully protected from the elements and any anomalous events that could kill him. After surveying 3 different options, he settled on the one most likely to suit his purpose. There was a depression in the south wall, about 8 feet off the ground. It was large enough for him to lie down and stretch out, with plenty of room left over for his supplies. He stacked several rocks atop one another to make a series of 3 steps, threw his pack and the satchel up into the cavity, walked up his mock staircase, and pulled himself up and in. The surfaces of the carve-out were mostly rounded, but he was happy to find a flat, if not concave geometry to the small floor. The ceiling was not high enough for him to stand upright, but it was close, and it stretched back at least 12 feet into the rock wall.
At least I can sit up without hitting my head.
A nervousness had grown in his chest. Before he left Telred, he had his light brown hair cut, but it had since grown considerably and was wet with sweat and hanging in his eyes. He sat down and surveyed the landscape outside of his new apartment. He nodded, happy with it. There could be a considerable flood in the cavern, and he would be untouched. If any debris fell from the ceiling, his surroundings would protect him. The envoy was not naive. He understood there were an enormous number of things that could kill him while he was under, no matter where he camped, but there was no other option. The only thing he could do was make the smartest decision possible. He wondered if his nerves were a result of concern for his well-being while under, or because he had to do it again at all. He hated it. Anyone that had ever gone through the experience felt the same way. It was horrible, though inarguably amazing that it worked as well as it did.
This isn't even going to be the worst one,
he thought.
The worst one will be the next one.
He shivered hard. Preparing for the Sterilex stint involved some work, so he got started. He would need the direct sunlight to read the placard for the dosing procedure, so timing was important. If he missed it, he would have to wait for the next day. He retrieved the blanket from his pack, unfolded it, and spread it out. Next, he pulled out a black bag with a large opening that loosely cinched down and a jar about the size of his fist from his pack. He unscrewed the top of the jar. It was a salve, a paste that he would rub on his skin to prevent moisture loss.
It should also prevent critters from smelling you while you're under,
Arthur Sterrett had said, billions of years before. He started with his feet and rubbed it all over everything, undressing and redressing as the process required. He finished by rubbing it in his hair, making his best effort to reach his scalp. It was unclear whether the stuff wore out over time or if it was only a mild version, but he never had to remove it after waking up. He propped the small black bag on top of his head as though it were a hat while he continued to prepare. The satchel had wound up close to the edge of the cavity. He grabbed it and laid out all of its contents: the placard, the glass bottle containing the Sterilex, the 2 glass rods, and the blade he used for shorter stints, on the floor of the east side of his apartment. In that position, he could use the bright western sunlight to his advantage. He rehearsed the actions in his mind many times over the next hour. He tried to remember the placard prescriptions. Arthur had made them memorize it cold during his training, but memories fade. He remembered
R1 this and G7 that, Q3 and years and thousands of years, millions, more. As soon as I can see the impression in the light, it will all come back to me.
He sat with his legs crossed and with the placard in between the forefinger and thumb of his right hand. Rubbing the face of the print side with the pad of his thumb, he could feel the scratches of the imprinted text. He was in position, and he waited for the light. The illumination event was not subtle. It was fast, bright, and painfully brief.
Showtime,
he thought. With the placard about 10 inches from his eyes, he rolled and shifted it in the light until the stamped text stood out sharp and clear. He located the duration column and found the 300M and 600M entries, one above the other.
Closer to 300,
he thought, and read the code. R2G1. Below it was the prescription for 600 million years, R2G2. He opened the bottle of Sterilex, picked up R2, the larger glass rod, and dipped it into the liquid in the bottle. Once the depth reached the 1 hash mark on the rod, he pushed past it slightly into the world of G2, but only a little, not even close to the 2 hash mark. He withdrew the rod, waited for it to drip one time, then smeared the liquid left on the glass on the underside of his tongue. He winced, as he always did when taking the drug. It tasted bitter and sour and awful, but the clock was ticking. He replaced the bottle cap on the Sterilex, placed R2, the larger glass rod in its place next to R1, the smaller rod in their pouch. With the thick felt rolled back up in the satchel and cinched, he tossed it on top of his pack. He quickly shuffled over to the ledge of the apartment and urinated down into the cavern one last time. With that done, he laid down on the edge of the blanket and pulled the black bag over his head. Grabbing the edges of the blanket above his head and down by his knees, he rolled himself up in it the way a butcher would roll up a cut of meat. He was in position. The only thing he had left to do was wait for the misery. 1 minute later, his consciousness was dancing in and out. His breathing and heart rate were slowing. The dream started, and what was left of his consciousness argued with itself as always. It was starting. 12. The dreams were bright, fast, violent, painful, and exquisitely pleasant. Visions of Osa, Dystria, Telraid, and Katya, the disaster planet, flashed and faded in his mind at numbing speeds. He panicked and responded to a growing feeling of sickness within him.
Something's wrong. No, it isn't. It's the same.
He stood on the patio of the launch facility where the migration division was having a farewell gathering for the departing envoy and his family. He was hugging his sister, who was sobbing with her 10-month-old son on her hip, his nephew that he would never see grow up.
It's not working this time. It is. You need to relax.
He stepped out into a lush green field on Dystria, his first mission planet. The air was fresh and exquisitely rich in oxygen, his attitude consumed with optimism and energy.
I won't wake up this time. You will. Relax.
He turned just in time to see the length of pipe come down on his head, and Jacko's conflicted expression as he brained the envoy.
This is killing me. No, it isn't. Relax.
He stood in his 3rd grade class with a billion butterflies churning in his stomach as he received a kiss on the cheek from his crush, Margot.
I can't breathe. You don't need to breathe right now.
A spray of blood splashed across the bulletproof window on the control room door as his wife took her own life right in front of him. She understood the lance was about to start, and she could not stop it.
My heart, it's going to explode. No, it won't.
He shared a firm handshake with Enos Domitor, president of Timur, the most powerful country on Telred.
I didn't take enough. Yes, you did.
He was back on Osa, standing on his balcony, staring up at the sky, looking for Orris among the stars. He could not see it yet, but looked anyway and took great comfort and joy in knowing that they were up there, building it.
I took too much. You took the exact amount required.
He was in space, but without his transport. There was a small red star in the distance. As the star got brighter and bigger, he noticed it was not a star, but a planet. It was Planet 5, and it was shades of red and orange. He was moving toward it at a breakneck speed. It filled his field of view before he pierced the atmosphere like a bullet, sending a shock wave across the whole of the northern hemisphere. A moment later, he careened into the ground, blasting millions of tons of material up into the sky. Some of the material even escaped the atmosphere and went into temporary orbit around the planet. He had become one of the projectiles, not an orbiting one, but cruising through the sky at white-hot speeds. Descending, he saw a sharp, pointed feature in the distance. He slowed and fell and passed over the point and down into the earth through a crack in the surface. He entered a dim cavern and plunged into an underground lake, about 18 inches in front of his own face.